So I think one way of looking at this moment is also in all these contexts is caste. And I think that's what I would try to do. Now coming to second point is I think it's very important when we talk about caste or about any other social reality, whether it is family or so-called Indian culture or any other thing, is to ask this question: who is doing it? Who talks about caste? Uh, and I think in my two books that are published on caste, I have identified three different moments of caste. And there are three different kinds of people and three different ways in which caste has been talked about in the contemporary history of India. I think first is the first moment of caste, when caste is talked about by the great people, right? People like M.N. Srinivas or any other person, or even Gandhi, when he talks about caste. What they're saying is they're talking about caste as culture, caste as tradition, caste as Hinduism. Right? So everything in India was caste, and they are talking about caste as something which was there in past and which has been there in past and which we have inherited from the past. So it's a kind of cultural understanding of caste, which also, in some sense, has been very mainstream social science understanding of caste. That caste, in some sense, signifies uh, India's exceptionalism, that there is something unique about India, and that uniqueness is in some sense personified or representable in the category of caste. The entire Indological Orientalist literature on India, in some sense, gives centrality to caste, and Indian nationalist movement also likewise borrows from Orientalist narratives and colonial knowledges about India, and that is what they are trying to, in some sense, invoke to claim India's nationhood, both for themselves as well as from the colonial rulers. And in that idea of India, caste is very central, and here equivalence is established with Hinduism. So it also implies that caste is India, India is Hindu, Hindu is India, and this is something which continues to be with us. And I think my discipline, sociology, for example, has been very heavily invested in this Hindu view of India and Hindu view of Indian tradition and the Hindu view of caste likewise. Now, this was obviously a political construct. I mean, all constructs are political at some level, but this we know right now, we know is very clearly a kind of, even though many people would not be doing it as politics, but it was in some sense a construct which comes from Orientalism, and there's plenty of criticism of that. There is second moment of caste, which I argue, and some of you might have also read my stuff and you might be aware of it already, and that is the question of mobilizational politics, when caste begins to be talked about as an aspect of Indian civil society. And I think it begins with the writings of Rudolph's, who published that book, I think, Modernity of Tradition, and where they are talking about caste in a totally different language. And see, when we were talking about caste in the first moment, we were thinking of caste as a traditional fact which would go away through development, through democratization, through modernization, through urbanization, through technology and stuff like that. And this is a moment when suddenly people realize that caste is also very, what one should say, flexible. So it has its own plasticity, and it can adapt to democracy very easily. And in some sense, Rudolph, so when they start talking about it, at the point that is also then well developed by Rajni Kothari in his book Caste and Politics India. So these people are talking about the way caste has been able to successfully come into democratic politics without really compromising the core principles of democratic politics. So Kothari is very excited, or even Rudolph's, they're very positive about this, in some sense, adaptability of caste to democracy, that how the caste can be, in some sense, a kind of pressure group in Indian civil society, and there's nothing wrong with it. at some level they don't abandon the traditionalist idea of caste. Yes, there is something called Indian culture, and that culture represents itself through caste. And if democracy has to develop in India, it cannot be completely alien to India. It has to, in some sense, adapt to Indian culture. The Indian culture also adapts to caste. So caste enters democracy, but in the process, democracy also enters caste, as Rajani Kuthari will call that. You have things like caste association. The very idea of caste association is a contradiction in term, because association means a democratically elected organization, and how can you have caste as democratically elected organization? So in some sense it's kind of coming together of the two, but in a very uncritical way, right? Uncritical in the sense that there is no problem in it, right? This is a good celebration, a good marriage of past and future, and you have Indian democracy which is remarkably Indian and remarkably democratic. And I think 1990s marks the beginning of the third moment of caste, with Mandal. And Mandal, in some sense, provides a new kind of legitimacy to the language of caste in democratic politics. But this language of caste is very different from the earlier languages of caste. This is not really looking at caste as tradition. This is not looking at caste as simply a medium for doing democratic politics. It's actually saying the opposite. And I think that is very, very critical. And that is the moment in which we are now. And this, I have in my book, the chapter title, short book, is Caste as Humiliation, right? So for the first time, caste begins to be articulated by people from below. This is a moment when people at the top do not want to talk about caste. They say caste is over. India is no longer caste. And it's the voice comes from below that, yes, it is over for you, but we still suffer caste, right? And I think that is the articulation of caste, which in some sense unfolds itself post 90s, right? If you look at the literature, all of us, I mean, Asim's book on Dalit capital, my work, Ujitra's work, even though she's worked on Agarwal Baniyas, or anyone else who is working on caste, we are not thinking of caste as one example of fine Indian tradition and how do we decode Indian tradition through the study of caste. Very rarely would people go to our Brahmins and ask them, tell us the details of rituals that you do at the time of wedding. Tell me the meaning of this word and what happens if the Dulhan goes 3 times before and Dulha goes 4 times before, or fire. Nobody is working on that. People used to work on this in 1960s. If you look at the anthropological work in 1950s and 60s, they actually used to do these things. I mean, people like Dumo, whom we still take seriously, they actually did things like that, kacha food and pakka food, and people doing this, people doing that. So those were the kind of things that people were studying. So in the third moment of caste, we begin to think of caste in relation to citizenship. Citizenship as caste being a source of denial of citizenship. And it's the Dalit who is talking about caste. And I kind of say this is also a moment of Ambedkar, where Ambedkar becomes, in some sense, the theoretical exemplar of doing conceptualization of caste. So everybody begins to talk about Ambedkar. And if we look at the number of books that have been published on Ambedkar post 90, I don't think there would be any other thinker. And if you were to compare them with the number of books that were published on Ambedkar before 90s, you would realize the number would be like thousands of times more in post 90 period books and articles. The third moment of caste is also the noisiest moment of caste. Why am I using the word noisiest? This is a moment of caste when you can't escape caste, right? Whatever you may try, because caste begins to speak a very different language. Caste is not trying to hide itself. The first moment of caste is an embarrassing moment of caste, where people are embarrassed about their caste. And even though they would say that, yeah, we are Brahmin, but this would go away, this should not be there. And people are kind of, generally, they kind of, at some level, looking at caste from a Western modernist perspective. So why do we still need to talk about caste? I think the point about avatar is important, because that is the language in which caste is globally talked about, or it was talked about. It is still not was, and I think very soon I feel caste would become a very different kind of category, in the sense that its identification with India is in itself a very interesting kind of subject on which one can perhaps write a paper. Caste is not an Indian word, as you know. Caste is a word that was used by Europeans, Portuguese, when they came here and they saw something which seemed very familiar, right? Which seemed very familiar because they had those things in their society, and you had a word for it, and that was called caste. So caste was, geologically, designed with things that don't interact with each other, and they were basically talking about hierarchy. And hierarchy is also a European term. Hierarchy is a word that actually comes from Christian theology, right? So there's a hierarchy in the church. So these are terms that come to us from Europe, and then they get identified with India. And there's no single word in any language of India which translates caste exactly. You have Varna and Jati, obviously everyone uses that, but Varna and Jati are very different terms. And they are not really, Varna is not an empirical category. Varna is a textual construct which kind of tries to provide you a certain position in the larger notion of hierarchy, but actually people don't live Varna, right? What we live is Jati. Empirical unit is Jati. But Jatis are also very differently understood. Jati is a term which can be used for anything. Zat, Biradari, right? We in Punjab call. But Jati is also, if you ask a botanist, Jati would be, classification of plants would also be Jatis. कितनी जातियां हैं, जानवरों की कितनी जातियां हैं, मर्द जात, औरत जात. So these jat is a very generic kind of term. It's not really specifically talking about caste. Varna, as you know, Varna, as you know, is basically a racial category. In some sense, it signifies color, but it's not something which is empirically present across the subcontinent, right? In South India, for example, most of South India, you don't have the kind of Varna hierarchy we talk about. We have Brahmins and we have what you call as outcasts, and then we have in between, right, who are non-Brahmins, right? So that's how they mobilize themselves. And this obviously, as we all know, it kind of gets institutionalized through colonial policies, colonial census, when people begin to then identify themselves as, we are this Varna and that Varna, because that becomes the medium through which caste is enumerated. And enumeration in some sense gives a totally new life to caste. So in my own kind of work, I've argued that castes ought to be understood as regional formations. There's nothing called pan-Indian caste and caste system as it was imagined. So why do we raise questions like this? And I think it is because the popular view on caste, which continues to be the textbook view of caste even today, is that we look at caste as, at one level, as I was saying, as India's culture and tradition, but underlying assumption in that imagination of caste is also that as India moves on, caste ought to disappear. Caste is not something that you need to worry about. So when India decided to become a developed country in 1950s or late 40s, when India was becoming independent, and we had a huge institution called Planning Commission, and India was kind of thinking about transforming itself, caste did not figure it out, right? The only thing that economists or the politicians talked about was the economy, right? Poverty mattered, right? Poverty also begins to be articulated as poverty only in the late 60s, when World Bank begins to talk about poverty. But what mattered was lack of development. People talked about peasants, people talked about rural poverty or rural underdevelopment, people talked about lack of industrialization, but nobody talked about caste. Not that they were not aware of caste. It was obviously there, and there were people like Ambedkar who were shouting and screaming, and through that process he was able to get quotas, despite reservations being accepted in the Indian Constitution. If you look at the first 5-year plans or any document, official document during the first 20, 30 years after independence, which is talking about social change and economic transformation, there's very little reference to caste. So caste was to, at some level, go away. And what I call it as, there was an imperative of disappearance, that caste would disappear and it would disappear on its own. Only thing that you needed to do was to go out and turn on the lights. And when the lights are turned on, the darkness will go. So caste also began to be seen as I was saying, a source of embarrassment, a burden of past, some kind of a disease. Even today, you would find books with title of problems of caste, or when middle class people talk about caste, they still invoke it as if caste is a disease, and a healthy person would not have caste, or a healthy society would not have caste. Now, all this language is fine, but this language, in some sense, again, is problematic because it doesn't allow us to take caste seriously, right? And this kind of falls back into what I call as the trajectory of Indian exceptionalism. So we need to talk about caste very differently. And I think thinking of caste as a problem, as a disease, as something which kind of ought to have disappeared, it hasn't gone away, and it keeps coming back in some form or the other, is still at some level waiting for it to disappear, and waiting for it to disappear on its own. So my final next 10 minutes, I will try to kind of discuss this very obvious question, why should we talk about caste, and how should it be talked about? And this is where I will try to kind of respond to Asim's question. So in the contemporary context, how do we think about caste, and why should we think about caste, and why is it become so critical to kind of think about caste? I think we should begin by recognizing that capitalism has no obligation to destroy caste. And I think, again, as I was saying earlier, the modernizers were not only Nehruvians or people who believed in the modernization theory. The entire, what one should say, generation of Marxists in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and for some reason, even in the third decade of 21st century, Marxists more or less continue to work with this very strange kind of blindness towards caste, right? And they somehow have this complete faith in capitalism's ability to destroy caste. And if it is not doing it, then very senior Marxists would say that because we have stunted capitalist growth. And capitalism is always, it is supposed to create stunted growth. If capitalism was a healthy democratic system, then it would not be capitalism. So capitalism has no obligation to destroy caste. And I think that can also be put in a different way, that we need to come out of what we call as the modernization imperative, right? That modern societies don't have things like caste. Modern societies are very different, and modern societies are based on class. And the understanding that capitalism at some level would eventually come out of it, and then there would be what we call as the idea of class will take over, and that would be different kind of thing. I have a paper published in Current Sociology. I can send you its PDF, where I've tried to define caste as ascription-based hierarchies. Again, this is what one would call as a burden of Western modernity, which continues to be very hegemonic for us today, and not only for us but also for them, right? So we must recognize the significance of narratives. The way societies get narrativized is very, very critical, right? Societies get narrativized in a particular manner, and then they begin to believe in those narratives for themselves, right? So I think enlightenment, in some sense, frames societies in a particular way as modern societies, and that narrative at some level becomes the ruling narrative for those societies. In that context, India is also narrativized by the colonial rulers, and borrowing from Orientalism, they somehow try to frame India as a caste society, and this is something that nationalists accept uncritically. So the point I'm trying to make is that caste is not only an empirical reality, caste is also a narrative, right? 1947, The northwest of India got divided into two countries, right? 1947, 14th of August, a country called Pakistan was created, right? My family came from there. On 15th of August, India celebrated its Independence Day. So after 16th of August, there was no caste in Pakistan, right? So Pakistan does not have caste system because it doesn't have a narrative of caste. It is the same Punjab, which the Indian side today has 32% scheduled caste population. It has Jats, it has Brahmins, it has Rodas, it has Khatris, it has Chamars, it has Adharam movement, it has Valmikis asking for rights, it has Bhangis, it has all kinds of exclusions, it has violence, it has Sikh Gurudwaras where Dalits are not allowed to enter in 1920s. There is a movement for that, right? And suddenly you have the same region which stops talking about caste, and what you have is Islam. And now people who are studying Pakistani society, they say that we also have Musallis and Sheikh Musalmans, and the entire Christian population is actually the Valmikis of India. So, not that ascription-based hierarchies don't exist in other societies. They exist in all societies. We have a name for it. Other societies don't have a name for it. Some have race. I think this book, which has just come out, though it's a journalistic book on caste in America, what is her name? Isabel Wilkers, forget full name. But it's a very interesting book where she's talking about caste. And this is not something that she's doing for the first time. My book, Caste in Contemporary India, I start my concluding chapter by reminding the reader that until early 20th century, there was a caste school of race studies, where people who looked at race, they looked at race from a caste perspective. That races were basically caste systems. It was Marxist, black Marxist sociologists who said, no, America is not caste because caste is religious Hindu system. We don't have caste system. So if one was to kind of take caste away from this Orientalist view of caste and look at caste as ascription-based hierarchies which you don't individually, in some sense, join. They are your baggage because you come from a particular kind of social context. There's a whole new literature on Europe which is talking about culture in a very different way. Pierre Bourdieu is one person who's talking about cultural capital and social capital. But if you were to invoke those categories to the study of society, what you find is Britain is a caste society. France is a caste society. Germany is something that we have actually studied. I mean, not myself, but we have a book called Inequality in Contemporary Capitalist Societies. It's called Inequality in Capitalist Societies. You know, they have this category of milieu. Inter-milieu mobilities are virtually impossible. And many of you would be aware of this new literature on mobilities, social mobility, which says that in most of the Western societies, mobility is virtually impossible. So there's a particular kind of set of occupations, set of communities in which you are born. You can use the word milieu for that. You can use the word caste for that. You can use the word social context. And over generations, people stay in the same context. And actually, over the past 40 years, mobility has been much easier. I mean, this is a study where we compare India, Brazil, and Germany. Brazil and India has seen much more mobility than Germany has seen. Interclass or intermilieu mobility. So if you're particular, staying in a particular locality, for example, if you're a German Iranian milieu person, people who migrated from Iran and staying in Germany for the last 5 generations, they continue to be in the same milieu. Right? Their occupation would be the same, their opportunities would be the same. So the point I'm trying to make is that the persistence of caste goes very well with capitalism, with modern societies, and it manifests itself in many different ways. Now, finally, if we were to think of present context in which how it reproduces itself, in case of India, I mean, caste is caste. Caste is not something else. If you think of caste purely from a cultural perspective as a Hindu reality, then you would look for hierarchies in a ritual way. But if you were to think of caste as a socio-economic structuring category, then you would think of caste as as inequality, right? As inequality, which is not simply in terms of, and we also visualize the idea of inequality very differently. Inequality is not about money. Inequality is not about how much property you have. Inequality, lived inequality, is how valued are you in your social context, right? So age is an indicator of inequality. Class is an indicator of inequality. Settlement is an indicator of inequality. Your body size is an indicator of inequality. Your skin color is an indicator of inequality. So we need to look at inequalities qualitatively. And the moment you begin to think of that, you would see caste everywhere, right? So there are people who have no other kind of attribute. I would say gender is also a kind of caste, right? So there's a particular ways in which ascription becomes the axis for structuring inequalities, and other things follow. I mean, you can be a useless man, and if you are working in a science lab, the chances of you getting an award is much higher than if you are a woman, right? You can be 10% or 10 times more competent than the man, but things would flow in a very different way. Same happens in bureaucracy, right? If you look at the state structure, the particular kind of people who get targeted and get promoted and get excluded, and you can actually study those flows, and they are very interesting kind of unique conceptual. So one is to think of modern state structure, democratic politics, where you could see caste, and this is something that we talk about all the time. We think of caste in relation to democratic politics still from the perspective of embarrassment at the first moment. But if you were to look at the actual dynamics, like the way people who actually do voting studies and look at caste as ethnic formations, right? Caste as structures which are durable, as persistent, then you would see how the entire democratic politics, caste remains a very, very central axis. You may say that it is weakening. People don't vote on the basis of caste. Even when they don't vote on the basis of caste, caste remains a very important point. In UP today, the chief minister is Rajput, is something that he foregrounds everywhere, and every Rajput foregrounds it everywhere. Hathras is a very interesting case where you would see this kind of intricacies of democratic political process, police, administrative structure coming together, and the core axis is that axis of caste. Second, another way of looking at the modern avatar of caste is something that Asim has been doing, is to look at labor markets. I have also been done some work in that field. See, in my own work, for example, corporate hiring. This is something that has not been much researched, but little bit work that we have very clearly shows that how the entire, if you were to study campus hiring, even in TIS, one of my students was actually do this work, and now she's stuck in Calcutta. She's studying. The idea was to study IIM Calcutta and TIS Bombay, and look at campus hiring and how campus hiring in some sense actually happens. And when the hiring managers come, invariably in engineering colleges, they get two separate lists, quota list and non-quota list. Now in engineering colleges, if you are a topper, you are likely to be put into the quota list because they want to keep the general list open for general category candidates. The whole structure is kind of designed in that way. So it's a very subtle way and not so subtle way, through the idea of merit, through the idea of quotas, caste kind of begins to, comes to shape. Similarly, Dalit capital and something that again, I've also done a little bit of work. And if you go to small town and you see how markets are monopolies, and they continue to be monopolies of kinship-based, what one should say, interests, right? They could be caste, they could be families, they could be larger kinship, and Dalits don't get kind of shops on rent, and even if they get shops on rent, there is kind of, they are marked that these are these kind of people, and that idea of prejudice, which is kind of and this comes out very, very strongly in the book that I'm reading now of that American caste. The third, again, something that somebody from Extis has worked on, Ujitra Punya, and another work which is by this chap called Amit Ahuja. Both these studies very clearly show not only that 90% plus marriages are intercaste, but they're very self-consciously, not 90% plus marriages are intra-caste, but they're also very self-consciously intra-caste. It's not like these people don't have opportunity of marrying outside, right? Agarwal Baniyas of Green Park that Ujitra studied. And the way caste socialization happens within families and between mother and daughter relationship, it's a wonderful study, and it's a very interesting kind of study. Very difficult to do these kinds of studies where she shows how young women realize their stakes in caste. And this is a big question actually now, the new research that is emerging from economics, which shows how kinship and things like caste become your only source of insurance, right? In a new liberal context where anxieties are so high, there's no state sector, you're not likely to get jobs. Most jobs are through networks, right? And in order to preserve those networks, marriages become very, very important. And how do you marry? Where do you marry? And will your existing kinship resource stay intact when you marry by your own choice? If that is the case, then it is fine. You can get married on your own choice. But otherwise, even for these young girls, the choice is to marry within the caste. You can have good life before marriage. You can move around. You can have friends. That is fine. But marriage is a major investment. Marriage is a kind of very life, what one should say, reproducing decision. Similarly, this chap Amit Ahuja, who did a kind of correspondence study, that you are offered, even people who do advertising, they would like write caste no bar, what is it called, the matrimonials. So if you send them proposals where everything that they have asked for, 5 feet 7 inch, fair complexion, well employed, all those things, and then say by caste Paswan, you will not hear, right? So it's very clear kind of, and you have seen, perhaps some of you would have seen this serial that was going on Netflix, Arranged Marriage, what is it called? So all this is at some level tells us that caste is as real as academy is. Caste is as real as family and kinship is. Right? We don't think of family and kinship as things that would eventually disappear. We have to only grow out of it. We don't feel embarrassed about it. So why should we not be embarrassed about caste because it produces inequality and exclusion? We should be angry about it, not embarrassed. We should obviously recognize that unless there is a concrete action taken, which is not simply an act of forgetting. An act of forgetting is basically blinding yourself to the realities of caste. So that is what Nehruvian generation did. That is what the present day elite wants to do, that we foreground merit, and we need to forget caste. We should not have caste blinkers. If you don't have caste blinkers, caste will still reproduce itself, because the kind of resources that people are born with, caste is very, very important. Not the only perhaps, but it's one of the most important structure that structures those resources, and therefore it structures possibilities, it structures outcomes, it structures eventual structure of every society, which I mean by inequalities, privileges. And caste is reproduced proactively by people who benefit from it. Those who deny its presence, they are the ones who, the privileged are the ones who, in some sense, are responsible for its reproduction. Dalits, when they ask for recognition of caste, they ask for its recognition because that continues to be a source of their exclusion. That continues to be a source that denies them citizenship. That's why Constitution is so dear to them, whatever might be the value of the Constitution. But it's so dear to them because that is the framework of citizenship. So they would want to live in the framework of citizenship. And in order to, at some level, open up that window, we need to recognize the reality of caste, which still, at some level, explicitly, implicitly, it may also be from inside, but also outside, at some level, creates those hurdles. And so I've, I think, spoken enough.
Thank you so much, sir. That's quite a big historical expanse, succinctly put in 3 avatars of caste and then the contemporary relevance. And as ever, you have put it very lucidly, and I So we can, can we take few questions for next 10 minutes or so? You had some commitment earlier.
Right.
Saket, over to you. Will you moderate the questions?
Yes, sir. I will. Sir, I have one question to ask with regard to the narrative point that you made. That how Pakistan right now does not have that narrative, but still it has inequalities and all that. My point is, if political class keep on persisting with the same narrative that we started off right after independence, then how do we actually do away with caste?
Sorry, can you repeat your...
Sir, if political class of the current times, they keep on emphasizing the same narrative of caste system, then how do we actually do away with the same system, with the caste?
There are very few societies in the world today which have been able to do away with the caste. And they have done it because they have very proactively worked at it. So first thing that we need to do is to develop a comparative science or comparative social science of caste studies, as caste as a central category. Say, for example, some of the Scandinavian countries where you would find the reality of caste is weakest. But in England, caste is very strong. So it's not something that can go away unless self-consciously. And I remember I was in Sweden for a year or so, and it's considered to be one of those equal societies where citizenship can be taken for granted. And people told me that it was just 2 generations back when I made my presentations on caste. They actually told me, and one of them said that I am a professor who used to be from untouchable caste. And if you go to this city called, what is the capital city of Sweden? There is in the central area, old city, and somebody told us that how some community members will come and pick up the garbage and they were not allowed to enter inside. So there was untouchability practice there as well. So we need to look at global experiences, how the effect of ascription-based hierarchies has actually been recognized and confronted in order to institutionalize citizenship. Modernity created an illusion for the West that it can take care of it through the idea of individualism and class, while all those cultures, whether it is France or Germany or some other European countries, basically hid their inequalities like Pakistan is doing. So don't talk about it, they would not exist. India is actually better off because we at least recognize the reality of caste. There is quota and there is voice from below coming now. So you don't really have those voices as being legitimate voices in countries that have no categories for ascription-based hierarchies, right? So that's why if you read this book on American caste, and she describes how we need this language, and that language would help us to show to the world that how kind of it is actually caste. Germany had caste, and the way Jews were treated, the attitude was exactly the same as you have towards Dalits in India. So you need to have narratives in order to recognize the political significance of those inequalities. I don't know if it answers your question. That's what I thought.
It's clear, sir. It's clear.
If I may ask a question, Saket?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Professor Jodhka, my name is Ipshita. I'm currently the chairperson of the school. As I engage with some readings on caste when I look at NCERT textbooks, and of course in the undergraduate levels here we teach some caste, and the postgraduate levels we talk about caste. But increasingly it appears that it is getting confined to textbooks of sociology. Okay, and it is not something we talk in our mainstream lives. We talk about so many things, but the way we talk about caste, the language that we're talking about, it seems to be fading from the collective imagination of newsworthiness. So newsworthy is when there's an atrocity act happening, but beyond that, talking about caste, recognizing its presence, or the other narrative is of course that around affirmative action or reservation. How do we, is there any way you see in the future when the young generation actually see caste?
Thank you, Ipsita. I think that both the things are happening simultaneously. I completely agree with you. But at the same time, there is also mainstreaming of caste. At some level, many more people think of their enterprise keeping caste variable as one of the possible variables. For example, health professionals. Uh, Last year, I was invited by some Health Foundation of India to talk about caste. And people who work on health today, they are sensitive to question of caste. And if you actually, you would find some work on health which would look at caste. 20 years back, they laugh at you if you talked about caste and health. Right? There would be absolutely no empirical material. People like us came up from nowhere. I mean, we were not really students of caste. I don't know if Asim wanted to study caste or not. I think post 90s, you have both these trends. That's what I was saying, that current moment. On the one hand, you have new liberal trend, which obviously tries to, at some level, erase any kind of identity-based consideration in the labor market, because everything is free and open market and you should not think of anything other than free competition, which doesn't exist anyway. They also know it doesn't exist. But the idea of merit, the idea of corporate capital and stuff like that. So that is one narrative. At another level, I think post-Mandal movement, uh, the young students or young people are willing to talk about caste much more openly than they did even 10 years back. I mean, my own experience is that when I teach students even outside JNU, places like Ashoka, when you interact with them, they are willing to listen to discussion on caste. And I think literature on caste is the volume of literature being published on caste. Economists have started working on caste. They still don't have categories. For them, SC/ST is one caste. It's very kind of, economists generally kind of, I don't know if you have any economists sitting here, please don't mind my saying this. So economists are simple-minded people. You need to have variables, you need to have data, and you need to be able to kind of process it through available softwares. But still, they are kind of, their work is useful because it is producing new kind of evidence. So there are now substantial number of economists working globally on caste, on Indian caste, and eventually they'll begin to compare with other things. And now there is entire economics of caste as sub-discipline, which wasn't there even 15 years back. So one can think both ways. I think you are right, because education is becoming more elitist, and that space is obviously completely devoid of any diversity. But at the same time, popular campuses are also becoming much more diverse. Dalits are coming in, OBCs are coming in. They are saying that we are also there, hold on. And they are speaking about themselves in a very different language.
Thank
Sir,
you.
there is one question from Asmita Jain. She asked that the caste is manifested in various ways like family, kinship, and division of labor. But personally, I've seen manifestation of caste prevailing even in educational institutions, especially during the times of student elections.
Sorry,
What is
what
your
prevailing within?
I have seen manifestation
Why does caste become so relevant during elections?
elections, student elections.
Elections. So specifically, like personally, I've seen a lot of politicization of caste from in my previous institute, especially during the times of student elections. So I just want to ask, why is there a specific reason for it?
Precisely, yeah. I think that is the reason, because that is a particular resource that people want to use in order to claim representation. So our middle class narrative of caste is Lalu Yadav and Mayawati and kind of all these people who are basically dubious and dishonest political entrepreneurs, and they want to use caste because they have nothing else to show. They are not meritorious. They can't be in politics on their own if they were to be judged on merit. So what they do is they mobilize their kinship. They do, no doubt about it, but they're very intelligent. They do it because they know that this can succeed and this would give them space. And when Dalits becomes a chief minister, when OBCs come in as OBCs, those who have studied Bihar and those who have looked at Bihar, their opinion about Lalu Yadav is very, very different from our opinion of Lalu Yadav. So that was the phase that Bihar on ground became democratized. I remember when I was growing up, only thing that one heard about Bihar was those senas of landlords and how many people are killed and the kind of caste violence. And there were what were called as booth capturing during election period. Doesn't happen any longer, right? People don't even talk about it. And this was because of this assertion from below. So it becomes very important to ask, not that caste, why is caste talked about? The more important question is who is talking about caste and who is able to most competently use caste as medium through which they can kind of network. That's what BJP has done very intelligently. They are able to weave alliances of small communities of OBCs in different areas. If you actually look at their grammar of electoral politics, it's very interesting. It's all woven around caste, and they would talk about Hindu identity, but at the same time they are able to give representation to smaller OBCs, and that's how they were able to kind of consolidate their voting in UP and Bihar that I earlier. Now I don't know whether it will succeed or not, but it's very well orchestrated. And this is not because these politicians want to do it. This is because now all these communities want representation, because they know that unless they come together, particularly those on the margin, that nobody will talk about them. Nobody will be able to, they would not be able to put their issues, because they also now have aspirations of being citizens of India. They're not really interested in staying in the village and doing scavenging work. They want to be in Tata Institute, and they want to be in JNU, and they don't want to become IS officers. They want to become IIT graduates. So that is where they need some networks. What kind of resources they have? No one else is going to stand for them unless they kind of come together. So that is my kind of understanding, but we can have different understanding on this.
Thank you, sir.
Sir,